Hey, 42 here. Imagine you're the captain of a large cruise ship steaming across the North Atlantic Ocean. It's a cold night, and you can see nothing but stars and endless blackness. Your mustache is twitching, a sure sign you're feeling uneasy, and not just because you had a bit too much sherry with dinner. Out here in the freezing open ocean, you know there's one risk to your ship, greater than any other. And that risk is flooding. Yes, unsurprisingly, the most common reason ships sink is because they fill with water. But if you fell for my careful priming, the first thing that popped into your head was probably icebergs. Of course, that would have been wrong because there probably aren't many icebergs around these days. But inappropriate climate change jokes and my subtle nudging aside, there's another obvious reason an iceberg may have bobbed into view in your mind's eye just now. Because of the sinking of the Titanic. By far the most famous maritime disaster of all time. It's a tragic story, and not just because scientists have recently proven something we've all suspected for a long time, that Jack actually could have survived if he just climbed on that damn door next to Rose, but a staggering 1,500 souls perished that night when the unsinkable ship did the unthinkable and sank. But that doesn't even come close to topping the list of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. Because there's something far scarier than giant ice cubes lurking out there in the ocean. Us. What really causes large-scale loss of human life at sea are not icebergs, but torpedoes, shelling, mines, depth charges, and when all else fails, kamikaze fighters. According to one prominent insurer, in 2020, a total of 48 ships were lost worldwide. By comparison, between 1939 and 1945, 14,341 ships were sunk. That's more than 2,000 ships per year. Yet, even in the company of such morbid statistics, the sinking of one ship in particular stands out for the almost unimaginable scale of its tragedy. And strangely enough, you've probably never even heard of it. Because, for reasons which will soon become clear, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff has largely been forgotten by history. And to resurrect it, we're going to have to go back in time to January 1945. Now, I'd like to take a moment to talk about hair loss, because I've had people close to me start to lose their hair as early as their 20s, and it's always been an upsetting experience. If you're in the same boat, then you're not alone. Did you know 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35? But the best thing you can do to prevent hair loss is take the initiative now and do something about it whilst you've still got hair left. I really like Keeps because it makes treatment super easy by delivering your hair loss medication every 3 months. So you can say goodbye to awkward doctor visits and waiting in pharmacy checkout lines. There's a good reason that Keeps has more 5-star reviews than any of its competitors, and hundreds of thousands of men trust them for their hair loss prevention medication. So, if you're like me, you're probably not ready to lose your hair just yet, but prevention is key. The faster you act, the faster you'll see results, and the sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. So, if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, do something about it. For a limited time, go to keeps.com/42, or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. The Second World War was nearing its end, and the Russian army was advancing on Europe from the east, intent on putting an end to Nazi Germany's hopes of establishing the Third Reich. The Russian army wasn't exactly known for its kind and merciful treatment of Germans, military personnel or otherwise, and so quite possibly the largest mass evacuation in history began on the Eastern Front, under the name of Operation Hannibal. Although a large number of civilians were taken back to Germany, the number one aim of Operation Hannibal was to bring a large chunk of the remaining German army back to the fatherland to continue the fight at home. Hannibal lasted for 115 days in the spring of 1945, during which time as many as 2 million people were evacuated. By contrast, the famous Operation Dynamo, that saw the rescue of 338,000 Allied troops from the beaches of Dunkirk, had taken just 9 days in May and June of 1940. During the evacuation of Dunkirk, every available ship or boat was drafted in for the rescue of the troops, and the same was true of Operation Hannibal. But there was certainly a discrepancy in scale. Dunkirk saw about 235 boats sunk and an estimated 5,000 soldiers lost during the evacuation. During Operation Hannibal, only 10 more ships, a total of 245, were lost. But there were more than 33,000 fatalities, and almost a third of them belonged to just one ship, the Wilhelm Gustloff, a huge vessel that had originally been commissioned by the Nazi Party as a cruise liner. On the 30th of January 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff was sunk in the Baltic Sea by a Soviet torpedo. The Gustloff was carrying Germans from occupied countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and East Prussia. Though there were also military personnel aboard, the passengers were mainly civilians. By most standards, these were innocent people, but this was the tail end of the biggest war in history, and the innocence of German civilians wasn't quite so straightforward in the eyes of many as it might have been otherwise. Fair or not, that judgment made sure the incredible tragedy of the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, very probably the greatest maritime disaster ever, never made it into the history books. At over 200 meters long and weighing more than 25,000 tons, the Gustloff was launched on the 5th of May 1937 to great fanfare. Being the centerpiece of the KDF fleet, it was originally going to be called the Adolf Hitler. The KDF, which stood for Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy, was a state-run leisure organisation set up in 1933 to reward the German people for good behaviour by giving them access to fun activities. You could say the KDF put the party into Nazi party. In the end, Wilhelm Gustloff's name was chosen for the ship. He'd been the leader of the Nazi Party in Switzerland before being assassinated by a Jewish medical student in 1936. After sitting next to Gustloff's widow at the memorial service, Hitler decided on the name change in Wilhelm's honour. Frau Gustloff was even invited to officially launch the ship. Before and during the war, devoted workers and Nazi officials were rewarded with cruises and concerts aboard the Gustloff. On its unofficial maiden voyage in 1938, the ship took Austrians on a 4-day cruise in a not-so-subtle attempt to get them to vote for the annexation of Austria by Germany. A neat little manoeuvre known today as the Anschluss. In reality, the Austrian populace were being threatened with a swift death for voting against annexation, so being bribed with champagne and seasickness probably wasn't necessary. The Gustloff took over 80,000 passengers on pleasure cruises between March 1938 and the outbreak of war in September 1939, at which time it was recommissioned for use as a hospital ship for the first year of the war. Towards the end of 1940, things changed again, and all the medical equipment was removed, and the Gustloff became a barracks ship for submariner trainees in Poland. Then, not much happened for the ship and its crew for the next 4 years. But in 1945, it was perfectly placed to help in the evacuation efforts of Operation Hannibal, and it was converted again, this time into an escape boat. By the time the operation began, most of the available ships were in fairly poor condition, and the Allied forces had a firm grip on the skies, whilst the Baltic Sea was heavily mined and teeming with Russian submarines. Oh, and despite what I said earlier, it was a brutally cold winter, so yeah, icebergs were actually a genuine danger too. All in all, the deck was heavily stacked against the fleeing Germans, and it was the passengers of the Wilhelm Gustloff that paid the maximum price. On the 30th of January 1945, the port of Gdynia was full of thousands of refugees, including women and children, soldiers, Nazi officials, and U-boat trainees, all desperate to get away. The Gustloff was the largest ship available, but it had only been designed to carry 1,900 people, including its crew. By the time it set sail, there were more than 5 times that number on board. Some people had tickets, but most simply forced their way onto the ship. And who could blame them? When the options are escape or death, you're going to give escape a go, no matter how dangerous it might seem. According to records, there were 6,000 passengers and crew aboard the ship. But the real number is thought to be upwards of 10,000, 90% of whom were civilians. When the ship left port just after midday, it was hugely overcrowded, with people occupying every space they could find, including the long, empty swimming pool. But nobody was working on their tan. Records say it was snowing that day, and the mercury was at 10 degrees below freezing. Inside the ship, however, the sheer number of people ensured the atmosphere was hot and humid, and many resorted to removing their life jackets in an attempt to cool down. Yeah, in hindsight, that wasn't ideal, but then again, a bit of extra buoyancy wouldn't have made all that much difference in the freezing waters of the Baltic Sea. In what sounds like the start of a bad joke, there were 4 captains aboard the ship, and they couldn't agree on the safest route to take. Some wanted to stick to the shallower waters along the coastline to minimise the chances of encountering submarines, whilst others thought the deeper, mine-swept waters further out to sea were their best bet. In the end, they opted for the latter. At around 6 PM, a German minesweeping convoy was spotted in the area, and to avoid any sort of collision, one of the captains ordered that the Gustloff's red and green navigation lights be turned on, lighting the ship up like a floating Christmas tree. By 7 PM, the Gustloff was being tailed by a Soviet submarine called S-13. Even though a torpedo boat was accompanying the Gustloff to protect her against subs, its submarine detector and anti-aircraft guns had been frozen, leaving the vessel totally unprotected. S-13 reeled in the Gustloff during a 2-hour chase before firing 4 torpedoes. There are rumours that each of the torpedoes had been adorned with a hand-painted message, and even though the 4th missile got wedged in the submarine's torpedo tube, the other 3 successfully delivered their mail. Within an hour, the Gustloff had sunk. Dozens of people were killed instantly by the blasts, and thousands more were drowned, trapped below the decks. Those who made for the lifeboats had to navigate a stampede in which panicked passengers were crushed to death. All but 9 of the lifeboats were frozen in place, and even those that were broken free were difficult to release because one of the torpedoes had hit the crew's quarters, killing the only people who knew how to operate them. Still, several lifeboats did start getting lowered towards the sea, but about 20 minutes after the first torpedo found its mark, the ship suddenly listed violently to port. The lifeboats that were being lowered on the opposite side of the ship were smashed into the Gustloff's hull, destroying them and casting their occupants into the freezing waters below. The few lifeboats that did make it down safely were soon faced with a new threat: boarding from the hundreds of swimmers already in the water. Eyewitness accounts speak of desperate men and women trying to haul themselves aboard the lifeboats, whilst the current occupants beat them back with fists, oars, and some choice German swear words. Support boats did eventually arrive, and between them they were able to rescue about 1,250 people through the night. They were the very, very lucky ones. Nobody knows exactly how many people died that night, but most estimates put the figure at around 9,400 poor souls. That's more than 6 Titanics or 3 September 11s. The last survivor was found at dawn when a German naval officer climbed into a drifting lifeboat to check for signs of life. At first, he found none, but amongst the bodies was a baby that had been tightly wrapped in blankets. It was still alive. That same officer will go on to adopt and raise the child as his very own, in what was one of the few tiny bright points on one of the blackest nights in maritime history. Thanks for watching.